It started the way most HOA meetings do. A half-full room, metal folding chairs scraping against linoleum, a long plastic table at the front with a crooked nameplate and a pitcher of water nobody touches. The agenda taped to the wall. Lawn violations first, then parking complaints, then new business. He was already seated when people began to file in. Third row from the front. Navy blazer that had seen better days. Collar slightly frayed. A small, dull metal pin neatly above his heart. Not flashy, not oversized. Just there. Some people noticed it. Most didn't. The board president cleared her throat and called the meeting to order. A few hands shot up right away. Someone complained about a trash can left out too long. Another argued about the shade of beige approved for exterior paint. The room hummed with the familiar tension of neighbors who knew each other just well enough to hold grudges. Then it happened. A man in the back, arms crossed tight over his chest, leaned forward in his chair. He'd been muttering under his breath for most of the meeting, rolling his eyes, shaking his head. The kind of guy who always sounds like he's just waiting for a reason. His gaze locked onto the old man's chest. He squinted, and then, loud enough for everyone to hear, he said, "That metal's fake, old-timer." It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The words cut clean through the room. Chairs stopped shifting. Papers stopped rustling. Even the board president froze mid-sip of water. The old man didn't react at first. If he heard it, he didn't show it. His hands stayed folded in his lap. His back stayed straight. His eyes remained forward. But the man in the back wasn't done. "You can't just pin something like that on and expect people to believe it," he added, louder now. "A lot of guys do that. Stolen valor and all that." A nervous laugh flickered from somewhere near the wall, then died quickly. No one wanted to claim it. A woman in the second row shifted uncomfortably. Someone else whispered, "Is that true?" The energy in the room changed. It wasn't about lawn height anymore. It wasn't about parking rules. It was about the metal. The old man finally turned his head. Slowly. He didn't glare, didn't snap back, didn't defend himself. He just looked at the man who had spoken. There was no anger in his expression, no panic, just something steady. Tired, maybe, or patient. The accuser leaned forward again, mistaking silence for weakness. "Well," he said, "you going to prove it?" A few people glanced at the metal more closely now. It wasn't polished. It wasn't displayed on a ribbon rack. It looked worn, almost understated. The kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking. The board president tried to regain control. "Let's keep this meeting respectful," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. The moment had already slipped out of her hands. The man in the back shrugged dramatically. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." They weren't, but now they were thinking about it. You could see it in their faces. Curiosity, doubt, suspicion, the uncomfortable possibility that maybe they didn't really know the quiet man who had lived on Maple Drive for years. The old man adjusted his blazer slightly, careful not to touch the metal itself. His fingers paused just below it, then fell back into his lap. Still no words. That seemed to frustrate the accuser even more. "Figures," he muttered. "All show." The room felt smaller. Heavy, like the air had thickened. Across the aisle, a younger man shifted in his seat. He'd been quiet all evening, sitting a few chairs away from the old man. Clean haircut, straight posture, hands resting flat against his thighs. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had been listening the whole time. And when the accusation hung there, unanswered, stretching longer than anyone expected, he finally began to rise from his chair. He didn't rush to respond. That was the first thing people noticed. When the accusation landed and the room shifted its weight toward him, waiting for a reaction, he stayed exactly as he was. Back straight, hands folded neatly over one another. Chin level. The kind of posture you don't fake and don't lose, even with age. His face didn't harden. It didn't crumble either. No flash of embarrassment. No flare of anger. Just a slow breath in, then out, as if someone had commented on the weather instead of questioning his honor. Up close, the lines on his face told their own story. Deep creases around his eyes. A faint scar near his jawline. The kind of marks that don't come from easy years. But his expression held steady, almost gentle, as he turned toward the man who had spoken. Not defensive, Not confrontational, just present. The room seemed to lean forward, waiting for him to fire back. Most people would have a sharp retort, a raised voice, a demand for an apology, something to fill the silence and push back against the sting of the words. He offered none of it. Instead, he let the silence sit. He didn't rush to protect himself, didn't pat the medal as proof, didn't rattle off dates or units or places most of the room wouldn't recognize anyway. He simply looked at the accuser with a gaze that felt older than the moment itself. There was something almost unsettling about it. Not because it was angry, but because it wasn't. The man in the back shifted in his seat. The lack of reaction gave him nowhere to land. Insults feed on response. Without it, they hang awkwardly in the air. "You heard me," the man pressed, though his voice had already lost a degree of certainty. The old man blinked once, slowly. His shoulders remained square, his breathing steady. If his heart rate had changed, no one could tell. He had probably been called worse in his lifetime, probably faced louder voices in harsher places. A community center with fluorescent lighting and HOA paperwork was not a battlefield. It was not even close. Still, it wasn't nothing. Being questioned in public, being reduced to a fraud in front of neighbors who had borrowed your tools and waved at you from across the driveway. That carries its own quiet weight. He adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, a small, deliberate motion. Not fidgeting, just precise. His fingers were steady, knuckles slightly swollen with age. When his hand brushed near the metal, he didn't linger on it. He didn't shield it either. He let it remain visible. That choice said more than a speech would have. Around him, discomfort grew. A woman in the second row cleared her throat softly, as if considering stepping in, then thought better of it. The board president shuffled papers that didn't need shuffling. Someone near the door checked their phone, pretending not to listen while clearly listening. The old man's composure began to feel heavier than any argument. He wasn't passive. He wasn't shrinking. He simply refused to be pulled into something small. His eyes moved from the accuser back to the front of the room. Calm, unhurried, as though the meeting might continue as planned. As though lawn measurements and mailbox standards still mattered. That steadiness unsettled people more than a burst of anger would have. There's a kind of strength that raises its voice, and there's a kind that doesn't need to. He embodied the second. His jaw tightened for a fraction of a second, barely noticeable unless you were watching closely. A sign that the words had landed somewhere inside him. But even that flicker passed quickly. He swallowed once, then settled again. No theatrics. No wounded pride on display. Just dignity. The man in the back shifted again, crossing and uncrossing his arms. The room's attention began to slide away from the accusation and toward the old man's refusal to react. It became harder to see him as the one on trial. Silence can feel like surrender, but sometimes it feels like command. And in that moment, without saying a single word, without raising his voice or defending his record, he held the room in a way the loudest person there could not. He stood up without scraping his chair. That was the first thing people noticed. In a room full of shifting feet and restless sighs, his movement was controlled, measured, almost quiet enough to miss if you weren't already watching him. He had been sitting a few seats away from the old man, angled slightly toward him the entire meeting. Same straight back, same still hands. But where the older man wore a faded blazer, this one wore Marine Corps dress blues. Not a costume, not something pulled from a closet for show. Pressed to perfection. Deep midnight blue that caught the overhead lights. Red piping sharp against the seams. Brass buttons polished so clean they reflected the room in tiny warped circles. Ribbons aligned with exact precision across his chest. Not one thread out of place. When he rose to his full height, the difference in presence was immediate. He didn't glare at the man who made the accusation. He didn't point. He didn't speak. His jaw was set, but not clenched. Controlled. Disciplined. A few people in the room straightened unconsciously, as if responding to something ingrained. The posture. The uniform. The unmistakable authority that comes from years of being trained to carry yourself a certain way. The man in the back hesitated for the first time. "You got something to say?" he asked, but the edge in his voice had dulled. The Marine didn't answer right away. He turned slightly, positioning himself So he stood between the old man and the rest of the room, not aggressively, just naturally. Protective without making a show of it. Up close, the details of the uniform became impossible to ignore. The eagle, globe, and anchor gleamed on his collar. The medals and ribbons across his chest were not decorative. Each one marked time served, places been, responsibilities carried. They weren't loud, but they were undeniable. Someone near the front whispered, "Oh." The Marine finally looked directly at the accuser. His gaze was steady, not angry, not emotional, just firm. There's something about Marine dress blues that changes the temperature in a room. They aren't casual. They aren't subtle. They represent something larger than the person wearing them. History, sacrifice, tradition, a standard. He didn't need to introduce himself. The uniform did that. The man in the back shifted again, suddenly aware that his earlier confidence had an audience it hadn't accounted for. The Marine took one slow breath. Then, without a word, he reached up. His fingers moved to the top button of his jacket. Precise. Familiar. The motion wasn't rushed. It wasn't theatrical. It felt deliberate, like something practiced. A faint metallic click echoed as the first button came undone. The room went silent in a way that felt different from before. Not tense. Focused. He moved to the next button. Then the next. Each small sound seemed louder than it should have been. The soft brush of fabric. The subtle shift of metals against cloth. The steady rhythm of controlled movement. No one interrupted him. No one laughed now. When the final button was undone, he slid the jacket off his shoulders with the same calm discipline. The fabric folded naturally in his hands, treated with care even in the middle of confrontation. Underneath, the white shirt was crisp, immaculate, the alignment perfect. His posture didn't falter for a second. He held the jacket carefully over one arm. Then, with a quiet step, he turned toward the old man. The contrast between them was striking. One uniform fresh and sharply pressed. The other metal worn and understated. Different generations. Same stillness. He looked down at his father briefly. Not for permission. Not for instruction. Just a glance that carried history. Shared understanding. Years that no one in that HOA meeting had been part of. The old man met his eyes. No nod. No dramatic exchange. Just recognition. Then the Marine shifted slightly, angling his body so the room could see clearly. The inside lining of the jacket caught the light. The weight of it in his hands was obvious now. Not symbolic. Real. He didn't speak. He didn't accuse. He simply stood there, dress blues jacket folded over his arm, gaze steady, letting the uniform, the posture, and the silence say what words no longer needed to. He didn't rush the moment. With the jacket folded carefully over his arm, he stood there for a breath, letting the silence settle into something solid. The room had gone completely still now. No paper shuffling. No throat clearing. Even the hum of the overhead lights seemed louder. Then he turned slightly toward the old man. The movement was subtle but intentional. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. Just purposeful. He stepped closer, closing the small gap between them. You could see the faint shift in the older man's shoulders as his son approached, not in fear or confusion, but in recognition of what was coming. The Marine adjusted his grip on the jacket. His hands were steady, trained steady, the same hands that had fastened those brass buttons countless times before inspections, ceremonies, deployments. He lowered himself just slightly, enough to bring himself closer to his father's seated height. And then, without a word, he held the jacket open, not to display his own ribbons, not to draw attention to himself, but to reveal what was stitched carefully inside the lining. There, sewn into the inner fabric, was a small rectangular patch, faded around the edges from time, thread slightly worn, but unmistakable. It bore the same unit insignia that was etched into the old man's metal. The same eagle, the same globe, the same anchor. A murmur moved through the room, quiet but undeniable. The Marine didn't look at the audience. His eyes stayed on the man who had spoken up earlier. He shifted the jacket slightly so the patch caught the light more clearly. Not aggressively, just enough to make sure it could be seen. Still no words. The silence now felt different from before. It wasn't awkward anymore. It was heavy with understanding. The old man watched the gesture without surprise. This wasn't something planned for show. It wasn't a rehearsed reveal. It was simply a son stepping into a moment. The Marine straightened slowly, still holding the jacket open. Then he reached toward his own chest. His fingers moved to one of the ribbons pinned above his heart. Not the highest-ranking one. Not the most eye-catching. A smaller one. Modest in color but precise in placement. He tapped it once with 2 fingers. Then he lowered his hand and angled the jacket again, making the connection clear without spelling it out. Unit. Service. Legacy. The room began to piece it together. The metal on the old man's blazer wasn't random. It wasn't purchased. It wasn't borrowed. It matched the insignia inside the jacket. The same unit his son now served under. The same emblem carried across decades. A lineage. The Marine finally spoke, but his voice was calm, measured, almost quiet. My father earned his before I earned mine. That was all. No raised tone. No speech about sacrifice. No listing of battles or deployments. Just a simple statement of fact. He didn't look proud in the boastful sense. He looked certain. Certain enough that he didn't need to say more. The man in the back shifted again, this time not out of impatience but discomfort. The certainty in the Marine's voice left little room for argument. The Marine lowered the jacket slightly, but didn't put it back on yet. He kept it draped over his arm, the patch still partially visible. His posture remained straight, shoulders squared, chin level. He hadn't taken off the jacket to show off his own achievements. He had taken it off to connect the past to the present, to make something visible that shouldn't have required proof in the first place. The old man's hands, still resting in his lap, tightened briefly before relaxing again. A flicker of emotion crossed his face this time. Not humiliation, not anger, something softer. Gratitude, maybe, or relief that he hadn't needed to defend himself. Around them, neighbors who had been skeptical only minutes earlier now avoided eye contact. Some stared at the insignia. Others looked down at their hands. The Marine finally turned his gaze fully to the accuser. Not challenging, not threatening, just steady. The kind of steady that says you were wrong without needing to spell it out. The jacket remained off his shoulders. The statement had been made. For a moment, no one moved. The weight of what had just been shown lingered in the air. Not dramatic, not explosive, just undeniable. The Marine let the silence stretch a few seconds longer, then carefully folded his jacket over his forearm again. The inside patch disappeared from view, but the connection it revealed did not. He stepped slightly to the side, no longer blocking his father from the room. The focus shifted back to the old man. All eyes returned to the small, worn metal pin to his blazer. It didn't look flashy. It wasn't polished to a shine. The ribbon had softened with time. Its colors faded just enough to show age without losing identity. The metal itself carried faint scratches, the kind that come from being handled, stored, moved through different seasons of life. It wasn't new. It wasn't decorative. It had history. The Marine finally spoke again, his voice even and controlled. He was 20 when he earned that. The number hung there. 20. You could see the calculation happening in people's heads. The old man's current age. The decades between then and now. The years most of the room had spent building careers, raising families, arguing over property lines. At 20, the Marine continued. He was attached to a unit most of us only read about. He didn't list locations. He didn't recount operations. He didn't dramatize it. But he didn't need to. The old man shifted slightly in his chair, uncomfortable now with the attention. His gaze dropped briefly to his hands before returning forward. He doesn't talk about it, the Marine added. He never has. That felt important. Not because it made the story bigger, but because it made it smaller, quieter, more believable. The Marine looked down at the metal on his father's chest. I had to learn about it from someone else. A murmur moved through the room again. Softer this time. The Marine reached into his inside pocket, careful not to disturb the ribbons on his shirt. He pulled out a small, folded document. The paper had been creased and unfolded many times. He didn't wave it around. He handed it to the board president at the front table. She hesitated, then took it. Her eyes scanned the page. Her posture changed almost immediately. Whatever she read wasn't vague. She cleared her throat, this time with conviction. It's official, she said quietly. No further explanation needed. The man in the back opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again. His earlier confidence had evaporated. The accusation that had seemed bold minutes ago now felt reckless. The Marine didn't gloat. He didn't even look satisfied. He simply stood there, steady as before. "My father didn't wear that medal for attention," he said. "He wears it once a year. Today." A few people glanced at the calendar posted near the door. The date suddenly carried more meaning than it had at the start of the meeting. "It's the anniversary," the Marine said. He didn't specify of what. He didn't need to. The old man finally spoke for the first time since the accusation. His voice was softer than his son's, weathered with age but clear. "I lost friends that day. That was all. No elaboration. No names. No stories. Just a fact." The room absorbed it differently than everything else that had been said. This wasn't about proving authenticity anymore. It wasn't about badges or paperwork or insignia. It was about memory. The medal wasn't a trophy. It was a marker. The Marine stepped back half a pace, allowing his father to occupy the space fully again. Not as someone under suspicion, but as someone who had lived through something most people in the room could not imagine. The board president handed the document back with both hands, a quiet sign of respect. "I'm sorry," she said, though it wasn't entirely clear who she was apologizing for. The man in the back shifted again, but this time he couldn't meet anyone's eyes. The truth had been laid out plainly, not exaggerated, not weaponized, just shown, and it was enough. The room didn't snap back to normal. It shifted slowly, like furniture being rearranged without anyone physically moving it. People sat a little straighter. A few avoided looking at the old man altogether, not out of suspicion now, but out of quiet embarrassment. The earlier tension had drained out of the space and left something heavier behind. Awareness. The accusation had been quick, casual, almost careless. The truth had taken patience. That contrast settled into everyone differently. The man in the back uncrossed his arms. For the first time all evening, he looked unsure of what to do with his hands. He cleared his throat, but no words followed. Whatever he had been ready to argue about earlier no longer felt worth saying. The Marine slipped his jacket back on with the same precision he had taken it off. One shoulder, then the other. He fastened each brass button calmly, restoring the uniform to its full form. There was no dramatic flourish, just discipline returning to place. When he finished, he stepped back beside his father instead of in front of him. Equal, not shielding, not performing, just standing there. The old man adjusted his blazer slightly, smoothing the fabric near the metal. The gesture was small, almost private. He didn't polish it, didn't draw attention to it. He simply made sure it sat flat against his chest. The board president glanced down at her agenda, then back up at the room. "I think," she said carefully, "we can move on." But the room understood that something had already moved. Respect isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in small changes. In posture, in tone, in the way people choose their next words more carefully than their last ones. A woman in the second row turned toward the old man. "My brother served," she said quietly. Not as a challenge, as a connection. He gave her a small nod. That was enough. Across the aisle, someone who had whispered earlier now looked directly at the medal with a different expression. Not curiosity, recognition. The man in the back finally spoke, but the volume was gone. "I shouldn't have said that," he muttered. It wasn't a grand apology. It wasn't eloquent, but it was honest enough. The old man looked at him for a long second. Then he nodded once. No lecture. No demand for anything more. The meeting continued. Lawn violations returned to the table. Parking lines were discussed again. Voices rose and fell in ordinary disagreement. But the tone had changed. People listened more closely. They interrupted less. The sharp edge that had been present at the beginning of the evening had dulled, because something had been revealed that went beyond a medal. It was about assumptions, about how easy it is to reduce someone to what you think you see. A faded blazer, an old man, a small piece of metal pinned to fabric, and how quickly that judgment can collapse when confronted with context. The Marine stood quietly for the remainder of the meeting, not stiff, not imposing, just present. His father remained seated, hands resting calmly in his lap once more. No spotlight, no applause, just dignity restored to where it had always been. When the meeting finally adjourned, chairs scraped the floor again. Conversations resumed in low voices. A few neighbors approached the old man, not to interrogate, but to shake his hand, to say thank you, to offer quiet words that didn't need to be overheard. He accepted each gesture with the same composure he had shown all evening. Not proud, not bitter, steady. The lesson didn't come in a speech. It didn't arrive in a perfectly phrased moral. It settled into the room through experience. Respect isn't something you force out of people with volume. And it isn't something you lose because someone questions you. It's something you carry, the way that old man carried his medal, whether others recognize it right away or not.